A very warm welcome to episode 6 of the Talk Diaries with me, Tanya Beckett. We find ourselves in a period of history which is riven with either political divide in the case of European and, for that matter, the American nation, between left and right, which it seems to be a very difficult to divide in which to find any commonality. But there are deeper and more violent divides that are going on in the world, which also deserve our attention. And one of them is the conflict that has been raging now for over a decade in Yemen. It didn't seem to be much in the news for a very long time until the conflict in Gaza started. And we have found then the Houthis in Yemen involved in that. But the question is why, and why is the underlying conflict so difficult to resolve? And for that matter, how did it start? Well, with me now is Elisabeth Kendall, I'm very pleased to say. She is the mistress and president of Girton College, Cambridge, and widely renowned expert on Yemen. Elisabeth, welcome to the Talk Diaries.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
So let's start on this issue of Yemen and what underlies that conflict. And then I'd like to get on to exactly how it became embroiled in the Gaza conflict. So what underpins that conflict? So maybe first we probably need to describe where Yemen is in terms of where it is regards to water and oil and so on, because those are very relevant to why the conflict started.
That's right. So Yemen sits in a geostrategically incredibly important position down there in the bottom corner, so the southwest of the Arabian Peninsula, and it sits right on where that waterway, the Bab el-Mandeb, links up to the Red Sea. So it's a thoroughfare for much of the global maritime trade traveling between Asia and Europe. And therefore, it's geostrategically very important. It has a long border to our ally, Saudi Arabia, and also to another ally of the UK, USA, etc., Oman, and a long maritime border to fragile states like Somalia, as well as, of course, the Red Sea coast. So about over 2,000 kilometers of coastline. So geostrategically very important. As for where the conflict in Yemen began, it depends how far back you want to go. You could go back actually centuries or decades, but let's think mainly to the most recent civil war, which began in 2014 when this group called the Houthis swept down from their strongholds in the north and took over the capital. What was going on there? Well, it's tempting to frame that conflict as a sectarian conflict between Houthis, who are a Shiite sect of Islam, and the government, who were mainly Sunni and were supported by Sunni Saudi Arabia. So to frame it as a kind of proxy war between the internationally recognized Sunni government backed by Saudi Arabia and other Sunni allies, and the Houthis, a mainly Shi'i sect-based government backed by Iran. But that would be really oversimplifying it. Essentially, it was a domestically generated conflict that was all about who controls power, territory, and resources. And then bolted onto that conflict were regional interests. We didn't hear very much about that conflict for many years because it wasn't really coming home to us here in the West. It seemed very far away. We weren't seeing Yemenis show up at the White Cliffs of Dover or turn up across the Mediterranean. It just didn't seem that relevant to us until in November 2023, so shortly after the Hamas attacks on Israel on the 7th of October 2023, the Houthis entered that conflict on the side of showing solidarity for Hamas and the Palestinian people. Suddenly, they started launching missiles and drones into the Red Sea at shipping and also at Israel directly. Then everyone sat up and noticed.
Right, they did indeed, and it proved to have the potential at least to be very disruptive. Why did they do it?
I think we can put that down to two main reasons. One is definitely some kind of ideological rationale. It wasn't just about that. The second is also opportunistic. Let's go to the ideological first. The Houthis have a slogan which they've been using now for over 2 decades at least, and it includes the words death to Israel, a curse on the Jews, death to America, victory to Islam. And so, of course, the idea of some conflict between the Islamic world, represented by the Hamas, and the Zionist Crusader Alliance, represented by Israel and its allies, fit very well into that slogan. So they decided to stand up for what they claimed to believe in. Secondly, opportunistically, the Houthis saw this as something that would work for them domestically, regionally, internationally. Domestically, because it would help their war-weary base to regalvanize them and indeed extend that base, because the Palestinian cause is very popular in Yemen, not just amongst Houthi supporters. Regionally as well, they could pitch themselves as the heroes of Palestine, and internationally, it catapulted them into the spotlight, into great media attention, and that's something they also relished. So for all of those reasons, it worked.
But you didn't mention in that list Iran. That must have played a role, surely.
So Iran has been backing the Houthis militarily in terms of both providing weapons and trainers. But it's very tempting to see the Houthis only as parts of this so-called axis of resistance of Iran. It's not just that. Yes, the Houthis are partnered with Iran, but they're not a direct proxy in the way that, say, Hezbollah in Lebanon was a direct proxy. The Houthis had their own reasons for acting in the way that they do, and as long as those reasons are married to the same agenda that Iran has, then they will remain firm allies. But it's not as though if Iran stopped its support of the Houthis tomorrow, the Houthis would stop. They wouldn't. They would still continue for their own ideological and opportunistic reasons.
But it did put the strategic importance of Yemen on the map, didn't it? Because it became very clear that it was essential in terms of trade that those waterways were safe.
Yes, and it really put the importance of coming to some kind of arrangement, peace roadmap with the Houthis on the international agenda, because you've got this group sitting there in Yemen on that incredibly important piece of coastline who can now keep holding it to ransom. Anytime there's some kind of policy internationally they don't like, they can start lobbing out missiles and drones. And the interesting thing here is that they don't even have to be that militarily proficient, because for them, the importance is simply harassing shipping or harassing Israel. They can just lob these things out without having to be accurate, without having to be sophisticated, and that in itself disrupts international shipping or has a psychological and economically damaging impact on Israel itself without necessarily causing that much physical damage.
Do you think that it's fair to say that the West, or perhaps the influential powers, not just the West, and the influential powers in the Middle East as well, had not really seen the relevance or the importance of finding peace in Yemen, and now they do?
I think that is true, that Yemen had not been very high up the international agenda, but I'm not sure how high it is up the international agenda even now. There's still some kind of hope, I guess, amongst big Western powers that somehow this war can be resolved, this Houthi problem can be resolved through military means alone. We've had many bombing campaigns now against the Houthis.
Yeah.
We had, for example, the UAE and Saudi Arabia launching their military campaign against the Houthis since March 2015 onwards. And 7 of the last 10 years, Saudi Arabia flew at least 25,000 rounds of airstrikes over Houthi-held territories. And of course, the UK and the US started bombing Yemen in January 2024. Israel subsequently joined in July 2024. America then launched a new campaign, which ran from March to May this year, and still the Houthis keep standing. The lesson here is that they really can't be bombed into submission. And there's no appreciation of the fact that the Houthis operate by a logic that's different from ours. They're not going to be cowed. And they're not afraid of casualties. They have a very high tolerance for sustaining damage and deaths on their own side. And they believe that they're fighting a just war. They also feel as though they've won the civil war in Yemen, having kept these incredibly well-supplied and well-supported military powers at bay for so long, Saudi and the UAE. And they saw what happened to America in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and indeed also after its 7-week campaign in Yemen. It kind of walked away. And most importantly, perhaps, the Houthis truly believe that God is on their side. So they are just going to keep going unless the military side of things is coupled with some kind of shift in the Houthi leadership that brings them more towards a diplomatic solution. And I mean, that's easy to say, isn't it? It's very hard to achieve.
Well, we'll come on to that in a minute if we may, but I wonder if it is a reminder, as if one were needed, because you've mentioned Afghanistan and you've mentioned Iraq there. And of course, we've been talking about this in the context of Hamas and Gaza, that is it a reminder that some of the values or priorities in some of the countries who would try to strike deals in the likes of Yemen do not understand how the fighting forces there are incentivized, that we look at conflicts elsewhere in the world and we probably see them with an economic or humanitarian even pragmatism that isn't recognized in Yemen.
Yeah, I think we are quick to judge by our own standards. One thing that's been very much underestimated is the prism through which people fight. Look, let's not paint too rosy a picture of the Houthis as these zealots leading by ideology. Of course, there's a lot of coercion that goes on. There's a lot of rule by fear. But that said, they are claiming the moral high ground here because they are standing up for Palestinians. This is the way they're pitching it, and this is the way they're perceived, in a way that other regimes around the region are not. And at the same time, they are indoctrinating their populations with these narratives, whereas we're operating by a kind of instruction. Our troops go into war on orders and on instructions. The Houthis are, to a large extent, trying to indoctrinate new generations, which means that this war cycle will go on and on and on, at least as long as we don't sort out some of these underlying causes, like Gaza, like a Palestinian state. And then finally, we also forget that perhaps those inside the Houthi territories are not hankering for peace in the way that we imagine they are, because war has become a way of life. Even before this latest war that began in 2014 and was internationalized in 2015, there had been many rounds of fights with the Houthis ever since 2004. So that's over 20 years now. So imagine that. If you are aged, say, 23 or below, and you're Yemeni and you're living in the Houthi-controlled territories, you will only have known war. And by the way, that's more than well over 50% of the population. You won't have known anything other than war, apart from a few breaks here and there, including a revolution. And so it's truly a way of life.
You mentioned Palestinian state there. I think a lot of people think that that might contribute towards some sort of beginnings of peace, but it's not a silver bullet, is it? I mean, the idea of a Palestinian state is not a new one. So there presumably are other factors, or are there other factors, which might be to hand to bring peace in the region?
Yes, so you're absolutely right. It's not as though we create um, the conditions that help a Palestinian state to flourish and all of this goes away. That's not at all true, unfortunately. Um, but it's worth saying that the idea of Palestine is such a bedrock, fundamental for many of these extremist groups, not just the Houthis, but of course Al Qaeda, which, by the way, still does exist, and not to mention the remnants of ISIS, some of which are ramping up again. It just doesn't go away. And if some kind of justice for a Palestinian statehood were to exist, no, it wouldn't be a silver bullet, but it sure would take away the the bread and butter of the narratives that these extremist groups are pumping out.
Hmm.
It would completely undermine what they're trying to achieve. There'd be lots of residual problems, but this glue that holds them together would disintegrate.
So if that were offered, then would you go as so far to say that that would really withdraw support for these groups? I mean, it wouldn't necessarily take away their ideology, which may well go further than that, but it might be that people, ordinary people in Yemen or indeed in other parts of the Middle East, might say, "Well, that's as far as we feel we need to go, and now we need to get on with our lives."
I wouldn't say it would kill the support for those groups, no. But what it would do is it would remove many of those middle ground swing supporters who tolerate these groups because they feel that they're the only ones speaking up. And it would take away their moral imperative. So it would be a very useful first step, but no, it wouldn't solve all of the underlying problems. It would need to be part of a broader package of measures.
It's a difficult job that peace negotiators have to do, isn't it? It's very difficult to know where you start.
Yeah, it really is. And, you know, it's so easy to sit here in our armchairs or in our universities saying, well, this is what's wrong and that's what's wrong and this is what's wrong. It's much more difficult to start saying, well, what are you going to do about it? Because, you know, criticism's easy. Constructive building of solutions is incredibly hard. So I am aware of that. And I have had my own bash from time to time on the ground at trying to do community projects, which I believe are essential ultimately to peace building. I think there has to be bottom up, not just top down.
Yeah. When you say community projects, what do you mean by that?
I mean, education, I think, is crucial to trying to undermine future cycles of revenge and killing. For example, we started, by we, I mean myself and some tribal leaders in the east of Yemen towards the beginning of the war to try to entrench a peace building project in schools. So if you catch the kids when they're 8, 9, 10 years old, before they've been recruited into militias or too brainwashed, and ask and just try to get them to think about problems from different perspectives and try to help them link actions to consequences. Um, you know, lots of small efforts can build up and be rolled out. The problem is it's dangerous work, it's really difficult, it's labor intensive, and you need to be on the ground. You can't just do this remotely from London or from a safe capital like Amman in Jordan or Muscat in Oman. I think, though, if I had to pick on 3 things that would be so important in solving the Yemen crisis, which of course feeds into the broader regional crisis that UN Special Envoy this week in his briefing to the Security Council called what's going on in Yemen both a mirror and a magnifier of the regional conflict, which I thought was incredibly wise. Those three things would be trying to build up a strong alternative to the Houthis inside Yemen. At the moment, the so-called legitimate government doesn't feel very legitimate. It's incredibly split. It's just 8 men who were appointed pretty much by Saudi Arabia with some input from the UAE. Much of what they do happens remotely, and they're pulling in, 8 men pulling in 8 different directions that have sort of broadly now coalesced into a north versus south civil dispute. So that's very unhelpful. Number 2 would be aligning regional actors, because at the moment, regional actors are sitting behind different factions in this war. We have Saudi Arabia behind something called the Presidential Leadership Council, this government. And then inside that, we have southern separatists backed by the United Arab Emirates. We then have Oman, neutral, but also helping to negotiate with the Houthis. And then, of course, we have Iran smack bang behind the Houthis. So trying to sort of bring regional actors behind the same vision for Yemen would be very helpful. And then lastly, got to start being more sophisticated about tackling propaganda, not just taking out missile launchers and military hardware alongside civilian infrastructure, but thinking much more about tackling the websites, the social media feeds, the propaganda machines that groups like the Houthis use to indoctrinate new generations and to keep the cycle of violence alive. That needs much more attention.
Thank you so much for sparing us your time and also giving your very expert thoughts on the subject matter. Liz Kendall, who is mistress and president of Girton College, Cambridge. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're so welcome. Thank you.